Although I grew up in a church environment, I went to Sunday school, Friday night youth. I didn't really understand what church is. I mean, in the beginning, church was a building for me where things happened that I liked, like hanging out with friends and doing fun things. But later, when I became a Christian myself, I came to know and follow Jesus personally. I was actually quite disturbed by the church. I didn't really know what to think of it. The people who called themselves Christian were pretty messed up. I thought church should be the gathering of perfect people. And judging everyone as hypocrites, for many years I tried to walk solo in my Christian faith. I did not really plug into church. Yet by God's grace, I did not stay arm's length from the church. Slowly but surely, God put on my path older and wiser men who have been around the block a couple of times and who knew the Bible. Christians who taught me two very important things: what the church is and what I should expect when I'm part of the church. And I want to share these two things with you, but I will use the book of Revelation to answer these questions for you. A book, by the way, that was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor during the persecution of Emperor Domitian, with the Apostle John exiled at the island of Patmos. So let's look at those two questions. What is church? Look at Revelation 1, verse 4 to 6. In Revelation 1, verse 4 to 6, it is significant how the Apostle John describes the 7 churches. I want to highlight 2 things here. Firstly, he describes the church as people loved by God, Father, Son, and Spirit, the Trinity. People who have received God the Father's grace and peace. Grace to you and peace from Him who is and was and who is to come. That's verse 4. People who have received the 7-fold perfect Spirit who is before His throne. Verse 4. People who are loved by Jesus, who loves us and has freed us from our sins by His blood and made us a kingdom. This is the first thing we need to realize. Sure, the people that gather on a Sunday or during the week in fellowship groups, even at youth, are an odd bunch. Different ages, cultures, interests, passions, you name it. Serious people, happy-go-lucky people, rich people, poor people, babies, kids, teenagers, grandpas, grandmas, snazzy people, sloppy people, people in high school, primary school, or university or out of school, working, homeschoolers. Now we can look at all these people as a bunch of weirdos, and we can see them from our perspective. Oh, I like you, I don't like you. Yet what I would like you to challenge you to do is to put on the lens of what the Apostle John gives us here and look at each person and realize that over each person are these words: loved by God. So much so that God the Father freely sent His Son to die for them, absorb the debt of their sin, to cleanse them of their sins. And He sent His Spirit to live within them so they can be His people and He can be among them. So if you say you follow Jesus, then start looking at His people as He looks at them, dearly loved. But secondly, it describes the church as, in verse 6, priests to His God and Father. Now, unfortunately, this word priest has gotten muddled over the centuries. Some people think of priests as people wearing mothball robes, living at the church building, waiting for people to confess their sins in the confession booth and serving some wafers at Mass, or just full-time workers of a church, or the special ones. Yet biblically, being a priest just means being a servant of God and people. Adam and Eve were servants, priests in God's creation in the garden. Israel was rescued from Egypt to become what? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus 19:6. People set apart to be servants of God, representing God. God's original plan for humanity remains His plan for us today, that through Jesus' sacrifice He has freed us to become what we were originally made to be, servants of God, imitating Jesus as our example of what it means to be a servant, a priest. As Paul writes, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Ephesians 5, 1-2. So if you believe and follow Jesus, then realize this is what you are. This is who you are, a priest. Every believer is a priest. You were saved by Jesus to serve God by serving others. The people at church, the people around you at home or in your family, your friends and school, everywhere. To love God and others as God loved you in Jesus. So when you walk into a church gathering, your first question should never be, what can I get out of this? Rather, how can I serve as Jesus served? But does this mean that everyone you serve will be super nice, everything will be smooth sailing? Does this mean that the church is squeaky clean? This is where Revelations chapter 2 to 3 is so important to us, because Jesus shows us what to expect in a church. And it's this: the church is messy. Very briefly, and I would encourage you to read these 2 chapters in your own time, Jesus describes the 7 churches and what they were like, what they might be. And what might surprise you is that none of them are doing well. The church of Ephesus is good and with right teaching, but they lack love. False teachers have infiltrated and influenced the churches of Pergamum and Thyatira, and leading them astray, many of them. The church of Sardis is so asleep that they're basically described as dead, with only a few really following Jesus. The church of Philadelphia and Smyrna was suffering violent persecution from their neighbors. The church of Laodicea was lukewarm, thinking wealth equals God's blessing. They were compromised. If there's one thing you can get from this helicopter view of the church, God's people, is that it is really messy. Just because Jesus died for us and freed us doesn't mean we automatically become perfect. Instead, the church is the place where messy people are being cleaned up and shaped to become more like Jesus. So, expect messiness. It's a bit like buying a second-hand surfboard. One of the guys in our church bought himself a 9-foot longboard that he wanted to use in Museberg. And when he bought it, the thing was really in bad shape. I mean, it had water damage, it had a huge crack, loads of dings everywhere, and it looked really manky. Now, I didn't quite see the point why buying such a messed up board, but he did somehow. And so, over a couple of months, he worked on this board, sanding off the coating, filling up the holes and dings, strengthening the board, even repainted the entire board to look different, and then he gave it a brand new fiberglass coat. When I saw the finished article, I couldn't believe that it was the same messed up board he bought. I've surfed with it. It is awesome. And in the same way, when Jesus freed us and purchased us for himself, we, the church, look a bit like that manky old board. We're messed up, and maybe from some people's perspective, we're not worth the effort. Yet Jesus didn't care what people thought about us. In love, he chose us, knowing what he was going to shape us into once we join his people. So see it this way: the church is Jesus' workshop, where through his people, he's shaping us to become what we were always meant to be, servants of God and one another, like Jesus is. So what is church? It is a group of messy people, loved by God, saved by Jesus, being shaped to become and be servants of God and one another. That's church.